Just as promised, I'm going to go into the seals now, and we're going to talk about some kind of interesting things. So Jonah quoted it to you from memory, but if you want to open your Bibles, and it's good to have your Bible open as I'm talking about this. We're going to try to understand these. Revelation chapter 6, verses 1 and 2 is the first seal. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the seven seals. Then I heard one of the four living creatures say in a loud voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. I want to walk up there and talk to you. I'm supposed to stay back here. We have a rider on a white horse, and you will find that there are some different interpretations. And depending on what school you come from, this rider will be interpreted differently. I will tell you what school I come from and how I interpret it. We see the four living creatures, or at least we see one of them. Now, there's something interesting. The book of Revelation is a lot about patterns and parallelism. There is a pattern that I have kind of deduced from the seals. And that is, at the opening of every seal, there is someone or something that announces the opening. And you'll see it as we go through. The first four are easy, because the first four seals are announced by one of the four living creatures, and it's a different creature each time. And we'll be able to try to deduce which of the creatures it is. The other three aren't quite as easy, but there is something that announces the opening of each of the seals. And I find that kind of interesting, that in heaven the seal is being opened, there is an announcement. And here we have the first living creature with a voice like thunder. Now, when we go back to Revelation 4:7, just turn back a page or two to Revelation 4:7, where we are introduced to these four living creatures. It says, "The first living creature was like a lion, the second was like an ox, the third had the face of a man, and the fourth was like a flying eagle." Interesting. Now, John does not pull this imagery out of the air. This imagery goes back to the Old Testament, to the book of Ezekiel and the book of Isaiah, in which both places describe four living creatures or four angels or four seraphs or seraphim that are around the throne of God at all times. So when we're interpreting the book of Revelation, we don't interpret it from our perspective. We look at what John would be thinking of. John is taking the imagery from the Old Testament. These four living creatures are angels that are about the throne of God night and day. And in Revelation chapter 4, it says they say, "Holy, holy, holy." So if we were to take a look at these four creatures with their four different faces, which one of these creatures' voice would sound most like thunder? The lion. Have you ever been to a zoo and heard a lion roar? If you're close enough, it's a little scary. It's loud. And it almost sounds like thunder if you're not paying attention. If you were just standing there and all of a sudden heard this male lion just give out a big old yawn and a roar, it almost sounds like thunder. John's almost giving us a clue as to which of the four living angels, four living creatures, was announcing the first seal. So the lion has a voice like thunder. It's possible. The rider here has a bow. It's like an archer's bow. But do you notice that there's no arrows? It doesn't mention anything about arrows. It just says he has a bow. Sometimes we read into the text what's not there. It doesn't say anything about arrows. It just says a bow. It's like having a gun with no bullets. He has a crown, and he is a conqueror. Now, how you interpret this first seal, how you approach it in understanding what this rider is, who he is, and what he's doing, will affect everything else that you do in the seals. And I will tell you that there are three different approaches. The first approach is the preterist view. Now, do you remember me talking about the three primary schools of interpretation. I'll do a quick review. The preterist is that things have already happened. It's all in the past. So that for the preterist, the book of Revelation was fulfilled in the first century at the time of John. There is nothing in the future. There is no prophetic long term. The preterist says this is only dealing with the first century with the context of John. So, there is a literal understanding of this rider on the white horse as a military conquest. This becomes some first century threat to Rome. And that's how a preterist would interpret this white rider on the horse. Now, I'm not of this school. I reject this interpretation. I do believe in prophecy, and that prophecy predicts the future. And as coming from the school of historicism, I look at prophecy fulfilling over a period of time. Now, the symbolic view, which includes both the historicist and the futurist, also take a look at this, and they see this rider differently. So we have Christ preaching the gospel as the rider on the white horse, which is his historicist view. The preterist view is that this rider on the white horse is the Antichrist. Now, there's some problems with this, and I'm going to share how they come to these different understandings. From the futurist point of view that views the rider on the white horse as the Antichrist, they look at the other three plagues and they see that these three horses, the red, the black, and the pale horse, bring plagues. And so they assume that the first horse is bringing a plague of war. So they kind of put it together and say, all right, it doesn't say it's a plague of war. It doesn't say it's a plague. In fact, the first rider doesn't even say that it brings anything negative to the earth. The second, third, and fourth do. Now, they look at the bow as a weapon of war, but in the Old Testament, the bow is not necessarily negative. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. We're going to take a look at an Old Testament text. But then they point out that there is also a white rider in Revelation 19. I want you to turn to Revelation 19. There is a rider on a white horse in Revelation 19, verses 11 to 16. All right, you there? Revelation 19, starting in verse 11. I saw heaven open, standing open, and there before me was a white horse, whose rider is called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and makes war. His eyes are like blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns. He has a name written on him that no one knows but he himself. He is dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. Who's this rider in Revelation 19? Would anybody disagree that this is Jesus? Is anybody suspecting that this rider is anything other than Jesus? No. But then when we go to Revelation 6 and we look at the rider on the white horse, somehow we see him as being different than the rider in Revelation 19. Now, one of the primary tools or principles of prophetic interpretation is consistency. You can't have a symbol meaning one thing in one place and then flip it in another place, because we would have no basis for understanding prophecy if it kept changing on us. So, using the principle of consistency, if the rider on the white horse in Revelation 19 is Jesus, wouldn't it be strongly probable that the rider on the white horse in the first seal is Jesus? Now, that's not the only element of evidence here, but it's a strong one for me, because I'm having a hard time seeing if one is the Antichrist and one is the Christ. How am I, the reader, supposed to understand that? Okay, so let's take a look at why this probably is not the Antichrist. You'll have to go back to Zechariah chapter 6. Did I put the text up there? No, I didn't. No, I just put the interpretation. Zechariah chapter 6, because John did not give it this imagery pulling it out of the air. We have here 4 chariots. that are led by 4 horses. And guess what the color of the horses are? The same color as the horses in the first 4 seals. John did not pull this imagery out of the air. This was not something that he just arbitrarily. He was using Old Testament imagery to present a New Testament understanding. So in verse 5, when Zechariah was trying to figure out what these 4 chariots with the 4 horses, the first one was red, the second black, the third was white, and the fourth was dappled. The angel answered me when Zechariah said, "What are these?" He says, "These are the 4 spirits of heaven going out from standing in the presence of the Lord of the whole world." So what did Zechariah say that these horses represented? Horses from God, coming out of heaven. Could John, in Revelation chapter 6, as he described the 4 horses of Revelation, be referring to a similar scene with a similar interpretation? Yep. Evidence of that. Here in Zechariah, these 4 horses, these 4 chariots, are spirits of God being sent out from heaven. Now you need to understand the symbolic nature of the book of Revelation. It is highly symbolic, but it draws its symbolism from the Old Testament. If you disconnect the Old Testament from interpreting the book of Revelation, you have no basis to understand the book. So, another piece of evidence that the first rider wearing white is not the Antichrist. In the book of Revelation, the color white is always associated with either God or God's people. The white robes, the things of heaven, all of these are dealing with white. So the color white in the book of Revelation almost always, and I can't think of a single time when white doesn't represent God or God's people. Now, the bow imagery, this rider of the white horse is carrying a bow, is not always negative or evil. In fact, the Old Testament, the bow can be either one. The symbology of the bow in the Old Testament is ambivalent. It can be used either positively or negatively. And many times when the enemies of God's people are carrying a bow, God squashes them or he puts them down. Let's take a look at the crown, because there is a difference between the crown in Revelation 6 and the crown in Revelation 19. A difference that I believe is explainable. Now, in English, we only have one word for crown. When I say crown, you think of what? You think of the king or the queen in England and the big bejeweled crown that they wear for royalty. But not so in the Greek. The Greek has multiple words for crown, or at least words that we interpret and translate as crown. One is diadem. That's the Greek word, diadema, diadem. What do you think that crown refers to? That's the kingly crown with the jewels. That would be a ruling crown. An emperor or a king would wear a diadema. It is a crown of authority and rulership. The white rider in chapter 19 is wearing a diadema or a diadem. But the rider in chapter 6 is wearing a Stephanos. A Stephanos is the word we get Stephen. The name Stephen comes from a Stephanos in the Greek. And a Stephanos is not a crown of royalty. It is a wreath. It is a victor's wreath. In the ancient Greek games, the Olympiad, the victors would be given a wreath of victory that they would wear on their heads. You might have seen some pictures where you see some of these victors. In fact, sometimes a general who has come back from conquest in the Roman Empire would wear this wreath of victory. He wasn't an emperor, he was a victor. So whether it be a victor in the games or a victor in battle, the crown, the Stephanos, was given to a victor. It is the same crown that we see Jesus being given in Revelation chapter 5, the victor's crown. It is the same crown that the children of God who are redeemed, we will be wearing victor crowns. We will not be wearing diadems. So when you hear or see the imagery of kneeling and bowing down and placing our crowns at the feet of Jesus, our crowns are not diadems, they are Stephanos. They are the wreath of victory. Because God's people are victorious in the great controversy. So we will wear. In fact, the book of Revelation refers to God's people in various settings wearing a Stephanos. So the word, let's take a look at the word for conquering in Revelation chapter 6. And this is where at least being able to use the tools to look at the original language comes in. It's kind of helpful. It says, its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, a Stephanos, a victory crown. And he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. One of the irritating things in Bible translations, modern translations, is that they take a Greek word and they don't translate it the same in different places. So we're going to take a look at this word. In Revelation 3:21, turn back to that. It's in the last church, the seventh church. It was one of the promises that Jesus gives to the Laodicean church. It says, to him who overcomes, I will give the right to sit with me on the throne, just as I overcame. Do you know the word there is the same word in Revelation 6:2? To him who conquers, I will give the same crown, or I will give the right to sit with me just as I conquered. It's the same Greek word, but we're in two different places. It's translated differently. In Revelation 3:21, it's translated overcome. In Revelation 6:2, it's translated as conquered. It's the same word. This is the difficulty that you get with translations. And sometimes it's good to look at multiple English translations to see how they translate them differently. Revelation 5:5. Take a look at that with me. It says, one of the elders said to me, do not weep. See the Lion of the tribe of Judah, he, the root of David. He has triumphed. That word is the same word as conquered that we find in Revelation 6:2. So whether Jesus has overcome or he has triumphed or conquered, it's the same word being used in the original language. Now, do you see how you can come up with maybe possibly different interpretations based on the way it's being presented to you? Do you understand what I'm saying? I see some dazed looks. Maybe I'm going too fast, too far, too quick. So, the representation of the rider on the white horse seems to be depicting Christ wearing his Stephanos and being a conqueror. What did Jesus conquer? He conquered death. He conquered sin on the cross. And why is he going out to conquer in the first seal? He is not going out to destroy the earth. He is not going out to do battle. He is going out to present the gospel to the world as a conqueror, as an overcomer. You see how, if you rightly understand, now this is the historicist interpretation, that the rider on the white horse is not going out to destroy the world. It is the gospel going out to conquer the world. And just as the overcomers, the promise to the overcomers in Revelation 3:21, they are conquerors too. Now, for those of you who have this chart, go back to the first church. What was happening in the first church of the seven churches? It was a faithful church. It was a strong church. It had its problems. All the church had its problems. But what was happening with the church in the first century? What was happening with the gospel in the first century? It was spreading. It was taking over the empire. Jesus, as the rider of the white horse, was conquering with the gospel in the first century. And the church, which is represented as the first church in Revelation, the church of Ephesus, was a faithful church. It was a church on fire. Yeah, they lost their first love, but they were on fire. Do you see how sometimes looking at the parallels kind of gives you some different information? We see Jesus and the gospel conquering in the first seal. Now, For some, this is a radical translation. But what does it do to understand? First of all, we see Jesus here, don't we? We see a positive message in the seals. Now, I'm going to continue. Matthew 24. If you read, I'm not going to read it. It's just too many texts that I've got to read. Matthew 24 was Jesus' discussion of what was going to happen at the end of time. And during this, he talks about four primary things taking place through the Christian era as he's predicting the future. He talks about the war, famine, pestilence, and then he says, then the gospel will go to the whole world. We see all of these in the seals. If this interpretation is correct, the gospel going to the world is seen in the first seals. We see war, famine, and pestilence in the other seals, which were predicted by Jesus in Matthew 24. And there's a consistency here. If the first rider is not Jesus, and if it's not the gospel going out to the world and conquering, then the seals have no mention of the gospel that Jesus mentions in his sermon in Matthew 24. Just another point of interest. Also, if this isn't the gospel going out, it seems that the first and the second seals are redundant. What point is there? Saying the same thing twice. So there's a lot of arguments, I think. The rider on the white horse also produces no afflictions in the world. The other three do. The other three riders of the horses produce affliction in the world. So the rider with the bow and a crown is bent on conquering in a positive way. But you're going to see when we get to the second seal that there are repercussions of this. Now let's take a look in the Old Testament at Habakkuk. For some of you, you're going to be really glad that you have your computers to look this up instead of looking up, because Habakkuk's not an easy book to find. But go to Habakkuk 3, verses 8 and 9. Habakkuk 3, 8 and 9 says, "Were you angry with the rivers, O Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea? When you rode your horses and your victorious chariots, you uncovered your bow, you called for many arrows, you split the earth with rivers." Oh, so there is Old Testament imagery of Jesus and God going out riding their horses as conquerors. Interesting. Oh, I forgot I put it up there for you. All right, let's go to Psalm 45, verses 45. Psalm 45, verses 3 to 5. I think this one will help a little bit more than Habakkuk. Psalm 45, verses 3 through 5. "Gird your sword upon your side, O mighty one. Clothe yourself with splendor and majesty. In your majesty ride forth victoriously in behalf of truth, humility, and righteousness. Let your right hand display awesome deeds. Let your sharp arrows pierce the hearts of the king's enemies, and let nations fall beneath your feet." Here we have another image of Christ, or God, as a conqueror, going out to conquer. Now, this image might seem strange to some, because when Jesus died on the cross, and in Revelation 4 and 5, what took place in heaven? Jesus was enthroned to the right hand of God in heaven. All of heaven recognized Jesus' sacrifice. They acknowledged him as Savior and Lord. But on earth, that didn't take place. You see, even though Jesus claims ownership of this property, this planet, based on his crucifixion, Satan did not give up the territory. If he had, then after the cross, all sin would have been done away with. There would have been no more suffering. No one would have died. Babies wouldn't have been getting killed. Children wouldn't be abused. But there is an enemy, his name is Satan, and he still roams this ground, and he needs to be conquered. But the conquering of God is not through force. It is through the pleas and the calls of the gospel. Come to me, all you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The gospel needs to conquer this earth, but it is not done with violence. It is done with the meek and lowly Jesus, who goes out to conquer through grace and love. In this particular picture, the background in Psalms 45 is the royal wedding of the king. He has a sword, a bow. He is a rider on a victorious horse. The victory of his is humility and truth and righteousness, the spiritual victory as much as a military victory. In Revelation, who is the bride of the king? The church. So the imagery in Psalms connects with Revelation, that Jesus is coming to win his bride. All right, the last thing I want to talk about on this, and I know this is confusing. How many of you remember doing parsing of sentences in English back in high school? Do you remember that? Where you had to diagram a sentence and you had to figure out what the verb and the participle and how many of you love that? There are a few weird people in this congregation, but for the most of us, we dreaded that English class. And we have mental pictures of our English teacher at the time that we used to throw mental darts at because we hated this person, male or female, because we could not stand diagramming these sentences and trying to figure out. Well, unfortunately, when you deal with languages, you have to be able to do this to understand things like tenses. You guys know what tenses are. I think we've lost tenses in our modern language, haven't we? We have. We don't have past tense anymore. We don't say I was, we say I be. We do, because we don't understand that the tenses give meaning. Well, the meaning, the tense here in the Greek for the conquering is extremely important. Got to get to the Revelation 6. This is what happens when you flip around. He rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. In the Greek, this is a present participle, for those of you who remember that. And a present participle is one that shows continuous action, going on and on and on. The conquering here is not just in the first seal, it is throughout the Christian era. The language here denotes that the conquering of the gospel wouldn't start in the first century, but continue on to the end. So do you see with all of these evidences that I'm presenting to you that for me, the best interpretation of the rider on the white horse is Jesus Christ, and the conquering is the gospel. And the gospel conquering that Jesus is doing will go to the very end. Is that a positive interpretation? Is that something you can read in Revelation and say, go get him, Jesus? But you see, some of the other interpretations would make this out to be a negative, scary, satanic antichrist who wants to just eat you up. Now, if you start off with that, then as you interpret the other seals, you're going to see the same kind of picture. But if you see the gospel conquering, it sets the stage for interpreting the next seal, which I hope to get to quickly. The white horse gospel doesn't end with the first century. It will go on because of the present participle. Conquering is a continuous, ongoing activity. Okay, so if I've done one thing, I've made you a little bit more positive on the seals, right? You haven't seen the seals as totally negative. So, let's move to the second seal. It's a little bit easier, it's a little faster, so don't think I'm going to take 40 minutes to do this one. The second seal. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Again, an announcement to the opening of the seal. Now, you got to give me a little bit of a time to tell you which of the four living creatures. The lion is taken care of. We got 3 left. We got the ox, the man, and the eagle left. Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make men slay each other. To him was given a large sword. Now, we're starting with the understanding that the gospel is the conquering experience. I really hope you get this. For me, the second creature was the ox. The ox, because it was an animal of sacrifice. And when we get down to this, you're going to see sacrifice being implied in this text. The horse is fiery red, a symbol of fire. It takes peace from the earth. Spiritual peace, not physical peace, but spiritual peace. In Revelation 1, verse 4, peace is offered. Jesus says, "My peace I give to you." But this peace that is being taken away, being removed, is the peace of the gospel from the first rider. This is a spiritual interpretation, not a literal interpretation. And the result of the gospel taking peace from one another results in slaying. The word used here for sword is the same word used that the priests would use for the tool that sacrificed the animals. It's not a weapon of war. It was a tool used to sacrifice animals. And that's why the language of sacrifice is in this text. And it connects with the ox being the sacrificial animal. There are 2 images blended together here. One is the language of war, and the second is the language of sacrifice in the second seal. By the work of this horse, peace is taken away. And what happens when the gospel is preached? Division. When the true gospel is preached, there is always division. Why? Because we are on Satan's ground. And the enemy is always against the preaching of the truth. And sometimes he uses people to oppose the truth that are good-hearted people, that are people that aren't evil, but they have not accepted the truth. They have not allowed the truth to transform them. And what happens is the same thing that's happening in our world today in the politics. We become divided, not unified, and the gospel divides. The second rider has come to take peace away because the gospel that is continuing is a gospel of division. Not intended to be, but practically it always does. In the fifth seal, we see persecution as the major theme, and we're going to get to that in a couple of weeks. The same word is used in both this seal and in the fifth seal for the slaying, or the persecuting, or the martyring. Think back to the second church that we talked about on your chart. What was happening in that church? And what was happening in the world? As the gospel moved forward, did everybody receive it? Were there people who rejected it? What about the Jews who turned against the Christians and started to persecute the Christians? Early on in the first century, Jews and Christians were considered basically the same. They just had some minor differences over this person, Jesus. The first century Christians didn't look any different than the Jews. They kept the Sabbath, they followed the dietary laws, they went to temple, they went to synagogue, but they had this issue over the gospel as it was in Jesus Christ. And eventually, after AD 65, when the Christians refused to defend the city of Jerusalem After the Christians bailed, when the Romans got ready to sack the city of Jerusalem, the Jews never forgave the Christians and started to persecute the Christians from that point forward. But not only did the Jews persecute the Christians, what took place during the 2nd and 3rd centuries? Persecution by the Romans. And we know from Paul's experience and John's experience that when they stood up for the gospel, did it unite or divide? It divided. So let's take a look at John chapter 16, verse 2. I think Jesus predicted this. John 16, verse 2. They will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, a time is coming when anyone who kills you will think he is offering a service to God. The word service here is directly related to sacrifice. They will think that they are offering you as a sacrifice to God by killing you. Did this take place in the 2nd and 3rd century? It did. This writer is not talking about going out to conquer peoples. It is a continuation of, you see how when you understand the first one, the second one makes sense. That the presentation of the gospel and the movement of the gospel into the world caused division. It actually caused persecution. The symbolism of war comes as a result of the first horse preaching the gospel. It is a blessing to those who accept the gospel, and it is a curse on those who do not accept. Has that changed since the 1st century? It is the same today as it was 2,000 years ago. The gospel divides people. To accept the truth of the gospel, to accept God's truth, doesn't unify, it divides. Let's take a look at Isaiah 26:3. I'm going to go quickly because some of you are leaving. I guess your bottoms are getting tired. This gets me excited, folks. This is amazing, I think. Maybe I'm the only one who gets excited about it. I don't know. Isaiah 26:2. Open the gates that the righteous nation may enter, the nation that keeps faith. You will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is steadfast because he trusts in you. Where does perfect peace come from? Accepting the gospel, accepting Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, allowing the truth of God to transform you. The perfect peace of God is yours. But what if you choose not to? What if you choose not to allow the gospel to transform you? What if you reject the gospel? What will that cause? No peace. The second horse takes away peace by the presentation of the gospel because it forces people to make a choice. Will you choose Jesus or not? Will you submit to the gospel or not? And I will tell you, from a person who used to rebel against God, there was no peace in rebelling against God. You do not feel at peace. Whereas one who has accepted the gospel in Jesus Christ can stand before the courts, stand before the flames, the martyrs, and say, I have peace because I have God. So the preaching of the gospel, the first horse, causes the division of the second horse, and peace is removed by the preaching of the gospel. Perfect peace, the peace of the gospel and trusting in God. Isaiah 57:20. I got to go faster. Isaiah 57:20. 20 and 21, actually. But the wicked are like the tossing sea which cannot rest, whose waves cast up mire and mud. There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked. The gospel brings about a decision which divides and separates. And for those who refuse to receive the gospel, there is no peace. Peace is only achieved by accepting Jesus Christ. And if you're waffling on this, if you don't believe me, try it. Try accepting Jesus and see if your life doesn't change. I guarantee it will. But the proof is in the pudding. You got to do it. You got to talk about it. Don't just go through the motions. You have to accept Jesus. Matthew 10, verses 34 through 36. Boy, I didn't come to church to be going through my Bible like this. I came to be entertained. When's this guy going to entertain me? Matthew 10, verses 34 to 36. Jesus said, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and anyone who loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And anyone who does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." That's pretty clear. These are Jesus' words, not mine. Jesus came to get us to make a decision, to either accept him or not. You accept him, there's peace. You don't accept him, there is no peace. The gospel brings division. And the last one, Luke 12:51. If it's not the last one, it will be the last one. Because you guys are getting tired. Luke 12:51. This is basically a parallel text to what we read in Matthew. But Jesus said, "Do you think that I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division." You know, have you ever seen the bumper stickers that talk about peace and we make love, not war? And you know, those are all wonderful sentiments. But Jesus says the only path to true peace is through Jesus Christ. It's the only path to true peace. But what's happening in our world today is we want a peace that is kind of based on false premises. We don't want it based on truth. We don't want it based on Jesus Christ. We want it based on what makes us feel good. And as long as we accept everyone and every position and everything and just, you know, what the world is teaching today, the secular humanist says this will bring about peace. We've been doing this for thousands of years and it's never happened. And there's this little thing that secular humanists just totally disregard, and that is sin. And until Jesus Christ conquers the sin in our heart, there can be no peace. So the second rider who brings division brings about, because of the preaching of the gospel, there is division on the earth. Boy, I'm glad I was done. But I want you to notice that as you put this chart, as you look at what's happening with the churches, you're going to see something happening in the seals. What was happening in the churches? In the second church? Controversy and division was coming into the church. Some of the church members, remember, some of you have accepted the teachings of the Nicolaitans, and it's creeping into the church. And division started to happen in the church. And we see it in the second seal, is this division taking place because of refusing to accept the gospel. Is this sort of changing your view of the seals? Are you starting to see them a little differently? I hope you're seeing them a little more positively and you're seeing them more in context with the history of the earth. This is important because if we do a good job in the first four seals, the last seals are going to get more difficult, but we're going to follow the same principles of understanding that the language here is spiritual language. The imagery is spiritual. This is not talking about literal war and people fighting on battlefields. This is the spiritual battle between Christ and Satan, between righteousness and unrighteousness. And John is giving us an historical picture of how this played out in our history that will be played out again in the last moments of Earth's history. When we get to Revelation 14 and on, which could take me a long time to get there, that's when we're talking about our time. And we are going to see echoes of what has happened in the past happening again. And John spends about 4 chapters, from chapter 13 through 19, I guess that's 6 chapters, totally going on the end time historical events. And unless you have a good foundation on the earlier chapters and the earlier parts of Revelation, you don't have a good foundation to really understand what's going on in the later verses. So let's sing our song. Let's close because you're hungry and you want to leave, and I'm losing.